I'm fighting a battle that you've already won. And it's quite appropriate for this morning, because we're going to talk about David and Goliath. Anybody know how David killed Goliath?
Is that a trick question?
Yeah. Hey? No. You see, that's what we all know, don't we? Eh? We all know how David killed Goliath. We've had about 5 or 6 different versions of David and Goliath already this morning.
I think he killed him with the strength of God.
Yeah, that's a good answer.
Should have read it before we came.
But why? It's a story in the middle of the story of David. And you can read the chapter before, and it talks about how David ended up with Saul. And then you suddenly get this bit, and at the end of this bit, in the next chapter, it tells you again that he ends up with Saul's. And you think to yourself, well, why put this bit where it is? Well, I don't know, is the answer. But it's there. And so we're going to look at it. It's one of those stories that we all know, as proven. And it says, the Philistines gathered their forces for war at Soch in Judah. And they camped between Soch and Asakama in Ephraim's dominion. So we'll forget those words. Saul and the men of Israel gathered and camped in the valley of Elah. Then they lined up in the battle formation to face the Philistines. So we know that the Philistines and the Israelites were going to have a battle. The Philistines were standing on one hill, and the Israelites were standing on the other hill, and they were looking at each other, thinking any minute now we're going to run down at each other, and all these soldiers must have been ready to run down at each other. But what happens? Then the champion named Goliath from Gath came out from the Philistines' camp. He was 9 feet, 9 inches tall. So a big fella. Wore a bronze helmet and bronze-scaled armour that weighed 125 pounds. There was a bronze armour on his shins, and bronze javelin was slung between his shoulders. His spear shaft was like weaver's beam, and then the iron point of his spear weighed 15 pounds. In addition to his shield bearer walking in front of him. What a sight. A man, full armour, 9 feet 9 inches tall, and he's fully protected, and yet he's still got a shield bearer in front of him. Somebody to protect him is front. And he's walking out. A guy 9 feet tall, even these days, well, 10 feet tall these days, and we get these people from time to time, would make you think twice about whether you wanted to confront him or not. Might be the softest bloke in the world, but his height would make you think twice. Do I want to tackle this guy? Well, the Israeli soldiers didn't, because Goliath challenged them. He said to them, look, if any of you lot come down and fight me, any one of you comes down to fight me and is successful, then we'll become your slaves. But if I'm successful, you become our slaves. And you will need to be under our authority. And so they looked at the trouble ahead of them. And all they could see were the problems, not the solutions. How often do we see a problem in front of us that's much bigger than we can handle? Much bigger than we can handle. Quite often we see these problems and we look at the problem and not the answer. We look to what is going to cause us the biggest issue. And we're looking at this problem and we can't get around it. It's all right, she's running around and enjoying it. We need to learn from that. Enjoyment. That's it, go to sleep. No, she's looking through the hole. Looking for the problem. But there is Goliath, the problem. And quite often we have Goliaths that we're trying to face. And all we can do is concentrate on the problem. Oh, woe is me, how am I going to handle this? And all the Israeli troops were like that. And it didn't just happen once. It happened day after day after day. They lined up thinking they could have a direct battle with the Philistines. And Goliath came out. And the Israelis trembled and backed off because they didn't know what they could do. And they weren't looking at the end result. Now David, verse 12, now David was the son of... Can you turn my microphone down a little bit, please? Or turn these other ones off. Turn the lectern ones off. Thank you. Now David was the son of Euphrates, from Bethlehem of Judea, named Jess. Jess had 8 sons, and during Saul's reign was already an old man. Jesse's 3 oldest sons followed Saul to war. And it goes on about their names. The 3 of the oldest had followed Saul, but David kept going back and forth from Saul to tend his father's flocks in Bethlehem. Every morning and evening for 40 days the Philistines came forward and took his stand. One day Jesse told his son David, "Take this half bushel of roast grain along with 10 loaves of bread for your brothers and hurry to their camp. Also take these 10 portions of cheese to the field commanders. Check on the well-being of your brothers and bring a confirmation from them. They are with Saul and all the men of Israel in the valley of Ephraim, fighting with the Philistines." So David got up early in the morning and left the flocks with someone to keep it, loaded up and set out as Jess had charged him. So David is doing what his father's told him. David is prepared to go and do just as his father's told him, and that is to take the food to his brothers. But not only take food to his brothers, but the commanders. You see, Jess had a real insight that he needed the commanders to be on side with his sons. So let's keep the commanders happy. We'll send them the cheese. His sons can just cope with the bread. Because who's going to keep his sons safe but the commanders? And quite often we miss this in this story because we're that busy looking at Goliath. You see, we're that busy looking at the problem that we miss some of the real meaning of the story. Jess had enough insight and enough understanding that his 3 eldest sons were going into battle. The people that could keep them safe were the commanders. So don't just look after your sons, look after the people that are looking after them. He's starting to look after what's around him. Who does he send? He sends David, who was looking after the sheep that were keeping the family afloat. Because Bethlehem used to provide the sheep for sacrifice. So here you've got David going out to see his older brothers. And to check on them so that he can take information back to his father. But like a good young son, he gets waylaid. Because what's he want to do? He wants to go down and see the battle. He wants to see what's going on. He's nosy. So out of David's nosiness, he goes down to the battle lines because his brothers aren't there. He's given the food over to the quartermaster, told him what it's for, and he goes down to look at the battle lines, to see what's going on, and to see where his brothers are at. And he starts talking, what's going on? And they tell him about Goliath and what Goliath's saying. But they also tell him what Saul is willing to do for anybody that's willing to face Goliath. And Saul's willing to give anybody that faces Goliath ample reward. Their family won't have to pay taxes ever again. Tax office would love that. But Saul is saying, if you do this, you don't have to pay any more taxes. You're free from your taxes. And I will give you this. And he will even give whoever faces Goliath, if they win, his daughter in marriage. And that puts you in a real strong position within any society, marrying the king's daughter. So that's what's on offer. And yet, all these brave soldiers are looking at Goliath and saying, no, this is too big a problem. It's not worth the risk. We're not going to step forward. But David sees something else. And he carries on asking. His brother, his oldest brother, gets really angry with him and says, what are you doing here? Get back home where you belong. You're supposed to be looking after the sheep so that we can be safe when we come home. We have something to come home to. Get your butt back home. But David continues talking to the men, and Saul hears about it and calls David to him. He's taken to Saul. And David then says, why are you looking at this problem? We've got a God that's going to look after us. I'll go out there and tackle Goliath. And Saul says, don't be stupid, you're a young boy. You are not capable of dealing with this problem. Quite often, with our problems, somebody comes up with an answer and we say, don't be stupid. You can't handle that problem. You're not qualified to handle that problem. I'm not listening to you. I'll go on and do it my own way. And yet, when it all turns out, we have to go back to that person or what they've said. But we look and we get bogged down. And the Israelite army had got bogged down. And yet David's saying to Saul, here I am, send me out and I'll go tackle it. And Saul says, no, you're too young. He says, yeah, but when I'm looking after the sheep, I have to deal with lions and bears. He said, he's no more than a big bear. He said, I can handle a bear, and I can handle a lion, I can handle Goliath, no problem. See, everybody else had been looking at this big man as a big soldier. David looked at him just as an animal that he was going to tackle to save his sheep. And when he saves his sheep, tackling lions and bears put David's life at risk. But he still did it to protect the sheep. Here he's saying, yeah, I know I'm putting my life at risk, but I'm here to protect Israel. I'm here to protect God's people. And so I'm going to stand in front of Goliath. I'm going to stand in front of this massive problem. And so David agrees to do it. Saul eventually says, okay, if that's the case, you can do it. But you have my armor. He was given the king's armor. And the king had him dressed in the armor. And David stood there and realized with this armor on, he couldn't do what he does best. Sometimes we put on a protection that we don't need. You see, my armor that God gives me is no good to you. You cannot put my armor on to deal with your problem, to deal with your Goliath. You've got to go to God and get your own armor. And David had his own armor. It didn't look right to the rest of the army because David's armor wasn't an armor that put him in a suit of armor. David's armor was God himself. And not this manufactured suit of clothing. You know, with steel breastplate and everything else. That wasn't David's way. And he wasn't used to it. So he couldn't cope with it. He hadn't been trained in that. So David did what he knew best. He picked up 12 stones. Or he picked up some stones from the riverbed. They were smooth. He knew he could use them in his sling. And so he went out to meet Goliath and his shield bearer. And Goliath stepped up to him and started taunting him because he was so young. But David told him straight, you've mocked God's army. You've mocked God himself. And therefore God's going to deal with you today. God's going to deliver you into my hands. And David had the confidence to know that God was with him. And that God was going to deliver this man into his hands. Not only was he going to deliver this man into his hands, but he was going to deliver the whole Philistine army into David's hands. And so David took that chance. And he stepped up and he took the stone and he hit Goliath in the head and knocked him down. You see, David hadn't taken out a sword to tackle the Goliath. He knocked him down with a stone and Goliath fell. But then David walked up to Goliath and took Goliath's sword and killed him. Didn't chop off his head, killed him. He chopped off his head after he'd killed him. So how did David kill Goliath? He killed him with his own sword. He didn't kill him with a stone. He knocked him down with a stone. He didn't kill him by chopping off his head. Killed him by the sword. Then he chopped off his head. It's nice and gruesome, isn't it? I think quite sometimes some of the stories in the Bible you think, oh, couldn't do with that. Yeah. Listen, David handled the problem. He didn't see a 9-foot man. He saw a grizzly bear. Something that he'd dealt with all his life. He didn't look at the problem and say, whoa, he's got a sword and he's got this and he's got that. He looked at this problem as a bear. And he said, if I'm going to protect my sheep, I do it this way. And with Goliath, that's how he handled it. But he gave it all over to God. He gave God the glory. He didn't say, I'm going to kill you, Goliath, but God's going to deliver you into my hands. He first gave the glory to God, not to himself or anything else, but the glory was God's. It says that eventually he took Goliath's head to Jerusalem. First of all, he went to Saul with it. And Saul then kept David by his side for the rest of his life, is what it says. Didn't let him go back to his father. He must have sent somebody else to his father. You can imagine his 3 eldest sons going back to Dad and saying, hey, excuse me, where's David? And the son's saying, well, our David did. And Dad saying, don't be stupid. You can just imagine it. But the thing is, it's the story of David and Goliath, I think, is there to tell us, don't look at the problem. Look at the solution. Look at what you can handle. And if you can handle a certain thing, that's how you look at this problem. Don't look too far into the future. Allow God to do the work for you. And David always, when he was looking after his sheep and his flocks, was looking to where God wanted him. So much so that he'd already been anointed as the next king. Prior to fighting Goliath, he'd already been anointed as the next king. Saul didn't know that, by the way, but David did. When we get down to verse 55, it says, when Saul had seen David going out to confront the Philistines, he asked Abner, the commander of the army, whose son is this youth, Abner? Your Majesty, as surely as you live, I do not know. Abner replied, and the king said, find out whose son this young man is. When David returned from killing the Philistine, Abner took him and brought him before Saul with the Philistine's head still in his hand. Saul said to him, whose son are you, young man? The son of your servant Jesse of Bethlehem, David answered. He was a young man of no significance, and yet God used him. We can think we shouldn't get up here to speak, that we should sit in our seat, but God can use us if we're only willing. We may think it's all right for somebody else to go sit out on the wall because they can talk to people better than I can. But God can use us. We may think we shouldn't be doing anything in church because there's people better than me at it. But God can use us. We also may look at other people and make judgments and say, they're too young, they're too old, they're not intelligent enough, they haven't got the right skills. But God can use them.
You see, they had a whole army of soldiers that had been trained to fight. And yet a young boy was the one that solved the problem. Somebody that had not been trained as a soldier, but had been trained as a shepherd. Somebody that wasn't in the right place, but did the right thing at the right time. Somebody who God had chosen. And sometimes we don't look for who God chooses. We look at a person's qualifications and what they're doing. So we need to remember some of the things of the story of David and Goliath. It's how we look at our problems, what we do about them, how we look at other people, and how we judge them. Those are the things that come out of the story of David and Goliath. Not of this little shepherd boy flinging a pebble at Goliath, this big giant, and killing him. But there is much more in it than just that. Too often we try and remember the story, and like at the beginning, oh yeah, we got all the right answers, all the right things that David did. Yeah, he cut off his head. Yes, he downed him with a stone. Yes, he stabbed him with his own sword. But that was nothing compared to the rest of the story. But that's the bits that we remember. Too often we remember the bits that sound good, that sound great, and not what they actually mean. We need to know that we're going forward with God together. That we're looking for each other and for what we can do with each other. We're looking for each other's gifts and what each one of us is capable of. And that's where we should be looking when we look at the story of David and Goliath. I'm going to leave it there. We're going to sing again, and then we're going to go into communion. One thing is that communion is part of our service. It's never separate. It's an invitation to all. It's an invitation to come and share in God's meal. In the meal that Jesus brought us. In the meal that Jesus brought his church so that they could remember him. And so as we sing, just prepare yourselves for communion. Or while we sing as well, while I remember, we'll pass around the offertory bag. And just remember, can you pass it to everybody? Because sometimes we've got two guests in, but I'm going to say this because I think it needs to be said. We've been passing it around and we've been missing people out. If you're a guest and you see people being missed out, it doesn't look good. So we pass it along the rows. And if you don't have hope to put in, you don't. Just pass it along. But make sure everybody it goes along all the rows so everybody feels part of, not left out or forced. You know, you're giving it to the visitor so they make sure they put money in. No, by the way, we don't expect visitors to put anything in. This is the offertory of the church, of this congregation to God, not anything else. But if you give by direct debit, just put your hand on the bag and say, Lord, accept my gift. Not out loud, but just put the hand on the bag and say, Lord, accept my gift. And that's all you've got to do. Okay, let's sing.